They were not elected, they were not audited, and yet for decades, millions listened. From living rooms to stadiums, from Sunday mornings to national politics, these pastors shaped belief, behavior, and loyalty at a scale few institutions ever reach. Their words guided not just faith, but finances, votes, and personal decisions, quietly, consistently, and with remarkable reach. This story is not about attacking religion, and it is not about disbelief. It is about power built on trust, protected by loyalty, sustained even after exposure. Over the years, investigations were published, lawsuits were filed, questions were raised, and still, the following remained. Churches stayed full, donations continued, influence endured. Why? What happens when spiritual authority becomes untouchable? When faith is used to explain away accountability? When is it framed as betrayal? This documentary examines 10 pastors who were publicly exposed and yet continued to be followed by millions. Not to provoke outrage, but to understand the system that allowed it, the language, the structure, the psychology. Because this is not just their story. It is a story about how influence works, about why belief is so powerful, and about what happens when faith and authority become inseparable. Once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. And that is where this story begins. Rick Warren. They stand behind pulpits framed by soft light and sacred language. Their voices are calm, confident, practiced. For decades, millions have invited these voices into their living rooms, their cars, their private moments of prayer. These pastors did not just preach sermons. They shaped beliefs, voting habits, financial decisions, and entire worldviews. To their followers, they were shepherds. To critics, something else entirely. And to most people watching from the outside, they became symbols of a question few dared to ask out loud. How much power should any preacher be allowed to hold? This story is not about faith. It is not an attack on belief, prayer, or God. Faith has guided civilizations, comforted the grieving, and inspired extraordinary acts of compassion. This story is about influence and what happens when spiritual authority becomes untouchable. When trust becomes loyalty, when loyalty becomes silence. For many viewers watching today, especially those who grew up in the golden age of television evangelism, these pastors are not strangers. Their faces are familiar. Their voices carry nostalgia. Some were once welcomed into homes every Sunday morning, right after breakfast. Others filled massive stadiums with worship music and hope. They spoke of healing, purpose, and salvation. And people listened. They still do. But over time, cracks began to appear. Not all at once, not in a single scandal or headline, slowly, quietly. Through court documents, financial disclosures, recorded statements, and stories that never quite reached the main stage. Questions emerged about money, where it came from, where it went, and who was really paying the price. Questions about power, who benefited from it, and who was protected by it. Questions about politics and how faith was used to guide not just souls, but entire nations. What makes these stories uncomfortable is not that accusations exist. Public figures face scrutiny in every field. What makes them unsettling is what happened next. In many cases, nothing changed. Churches stayed full, donations kept flowing, television programs continued uninterrupted. Followers defended, explained, forgave, or simply ignored what had been revealed. Some believers said the criticism was persecution. Others said it was jealousy. Many said it was irrelevant, that God could use imperfect people. And perhaps that is true. But that belief, repeated often enough, became something more than grace. It became a shield, a way to stop asking questions. This chapter begins at the moment where admiration quietly turned into dependence, when pastors stopped being spiritual guides and became institutions, when sermons were no longer just messages, but branding, when the line between church and corporation blurred so completely that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Television changed everything. For the first time in history, a preacher could reach millions at once without accountability from a local community. Charisma traveled farther than character. A powerful voice mattered more than a transparent life. And with each new broadcast, a relationship was formed, one-sided, intimate, and deeply emotional. Viewers felt known. Pastors remained distant. That imbalance became the foundation of modern religious influence. As ministries expanded, so did lifestyles. Private jets were justified as tools for spreading the gospel. Mansions were reframed as blessings. Wealth was no longer a byproduct of success. It became proof of divine favor. To question it was to question God Himself. And for many followers, that was a line they would never cross. At the same time, these pastors were not operating in a vacuum. They built networks, legal teams, media departments, political connections. Some advised presidents, others shaped policy through prayer breakfasts and endorsements. Their words reached beyond churches and into the laws that governed everyday life. Yet unlike elected officials, they were never voted in. And unlike corporations, they were rarely audited in ways the public could see. When scandals did break into the open, financial misconduct, moral failures, abuse of power, responses followed a familiar script. Apologies were carefully worded, responsibility was deflected, redemption narratives were introduced quickly, often before the full story was understood. In many cases, consequences were temporary, a brief absence, a sabbatical, a return to the pulpit. What allowed this cycle to continue was not ignorance, it was loyalty. For followers who had built their identity around these leaders, walking away felt like betrayal, not of a pastor, but of faith itself. The cost of questioning became too high. Silence felt safer. This chapter is the beginning of a larger examination, not of 10 men alone, but of a system that allowed them to rise, fall, and rise again, often unchanged. A system where exposure did not end influence, where revelation did not break devotion, where millions continued to follow even after seeing the truth. In the chapters that follow, we will look closely at these pastors, their rise, their controversies, and the moments that should have changed everything. But before we do, it is important to understand this. None of this could have happened without willing audiences, without trust freely given, without the human need for certainty, hope, and guidance in a chaotic world. This is not a story about villains and victims. It is a story about power, how it is built, protected, and preserved in the name of faith. And once you see how it works, it becomes very difficult to unsee. John Hagee. By the time these pastors reached national prominence, their ministries no longer resembled small churches. They were ecosystems, television studios, publishing arms, speaking circuits, donation pipelines, legal advisors, and public relations teams all working in quiet coordination. What looked like a sermon on Sunday was often the final product of a week of scripting, messaging, and strategic framing. Faith was still present, but it was now delivered through a system built to scale. For followers, this growth felt like validation. Bigger crowds meant God was moving. Expanding budgets meant the message was working. Influence itself became evidence of righteousness. The idea that something so widely embraced could also be deeply flawed felt impossible to accept, and so success protected authority. The larger the platform, the harder it became to challenge what was happening behind the scenes. Money played a central role, but rarely in obvious ways. Donations were framed as obedience, not transactions. Giving was not encouraged, it was spiritualized. Viewers were told their faith would be measured by their sacrifice, their blessing determined by their generosity. In this environment, financial transparency felt unnecessary. Questioning where money went sounded like a lack of trust, not responsible stewardship. For older generations raised to respect clergy without hesitation, this message landed easily. Pastors were taught to be beyond reproach. Their authority was moral, not administrative. They answered to God, not to congregations. That belief, passed down over decades, became the emotional backbone of unwavering loyalty. But as the ministries grew, distance grew with them. Followers felt closer than ever, yet knew less than ever. Personal access disappeared. Decisions were centralized. Boards were filled with allies. Accountability became internal and therefore invisible. When mistakes happened, explanations came filtered, softened, delayed. Criticism, when it appeared, was often reframed as spiritual warfare. Reporters were described as enemies of faith. Whistleblowers were labeled bitter or broken. Former insiders were dismissed as backsliders. The narrative was simple and effective. If you were against the pastor, you were against the mission. And if you were against the mission, you were against God. This framing worked because it played on fear, not fear of the pastor, but fear of uncertainty. For many followers, these leaders were anchors in a rapidly changing world. They offered clear answers when society felt unstable. They spoke with certainty when institutions lost credibility. To question them meant reopening doubts people had worked hard to bury. Politics entered quietly, then all at once. Sermons began to echo talking points. Prayer requests mirrored campaign language. Candidates were praised from pulpits without endorsements ever being spoken aloud. For followers, the blending felt natural. Faith had always guided values. Now it guided votes. And because the message came from trusted spiritual leaders, it carried moral weight that no politician could replicate. Exposure did not arrive as a single moment of collapse. It arrived in fragments. A lawsuit here, a leaked recording there, a financial report that raised more questions than answers. For many viewers, these moments passed quickly. A headline changed, a channel switched, a new sermon aired. The emotional cost of paying attention felt higher than the effort required to look away. When consequences did arrive, they were often symbolic. A resignation that didn't end influence, a pause that didn't change control, a public apology followed by a quiet return. Each cycle reinforced a dangerous lesson. Survival was possible without accountability. Influence could outlast truth. What remained untouched was the bond between leader and follower. It was not logical. It was emotional. Many had built their lives around these ministries. Friendships, marriages, recoveries, even identities were tied to these churches. Admitting betrayal meant admitting vulnerability. It meant accepting that trust had been misplaced. For many, that pain was too heavy to confront. This is where loyalty became something else. It stopped being about belief and became about self-preservation. Protecting the pastor meant protecting one's own past decisions. It meant protecting memories that still felt sacred. The truth, when it threatened that foundation, was treated as an intruder. It's not about condemning belief. It is about recognizing a pattern, a system where exposure did not lead to reform, but to reinforcement, where criticism strengthened devotion, where leaders learned that survival depended not on innocence, but on narrative control. As this story continues, the focus will narrow. Individual names, specific moments, clear evidence. But it is important to understand that what you are seeing is not accidental. It is the result of decades of conditioning, cultural, spiritual, and psychological. The question is no longer whether these pastors were exposed. The question is why exposure was never enough. Robert Tilton. The most powerful protection these pastors possessed was not money, lawyers, or political connections. It was narrative. Long before any scandal surfaced, a framework had already been planted in the minds of followers, a way to interpret doubt, criticism, and exposure without ever allowing those things to threaten loyalty. The story was written in advance, and when reality challenged it, the story won. From the pulpit, listeners were taught that true faith would be tested, that attacks would come, that enemies would rise when God was doing something important. These ideas were not new. They had deep roots in religious tradition. But in this modern context, they served a second purpose. They trained audiences to expect accusations and to dismiss them before they were ever heard. So when investigations appeared, many followers didn't evaluate the facts. They recognized the pattern. This was what persecution looked like. This was what the Bible warned about. The exposure itself became proof that the pastor mattered. Criticism was no longer neutral information. It was spiritual confirmation. Language mattered. Pastors rarely denied allegations directly. Instead, they spoke in abstractions. They asked for prayer. They spoke of storms and seasons. They framed themselves as wounded servants carrying a heavy burden for the sake of others. Responsibility dissolved into metaphor, and metaphors are difficult to challenge. For audiences who trusted these leaders for decades, this framing felt familiar and comforting. It allowed believers to stay loyal without feeling dishonest. They didn't have to reject evidence outright. They simply didn't have to look at it closely. Ambiguity became refuge. Another layer of protection came from selective transparency. Just enough information was shared to appear honest, but never enough to invite real scrutiny. Internal investigations were announced, but rarely released. Independent reviews were mentioned, but not published. Apologies were offered without details. Each step gave the impression of accountability while preserving control. The media environment played a role as well. In earlier decades, limited channels meant limited challenge. Viewers trusted what they saw because alternatives were scarce. Even as the internet expanded access to information, many older followers remained within familiar ecosystems. Church networks, preferred news outlets, and ministry-owned platforms. Exposure existed, but it did not always reach the people most affected by it. And when it did, it often arrived stripped of context. Headlines without follow-up, clips without background, accusations without resolution. In that vacuum, pastors filled the silence with interpretation. They told their side first, and often last. By the time fuller stories emerged, opinions were already fixed. There was also the quiet power of gratitude. Many followers felt they owed these pastors something: a marriage saved, an addiction broken, a moment of hope during grief. These experiences were real and meaningful, and they created emotional debt. When allegations surfaced, defending the pastor felt like honoring those past miracles. Questioning felt ungrateful. Over time, this loyalty became communal. Entire churches moved together. Doubt became dangerous not because it threatened faith, but because it threatened belonging. To ask questions was to risk isolation. To leave was to lose community. For older viewers especially, whose social circles were often deeply tied to church life, the cost of separation felt overwhelming. This is how belief systems harden, not through force, but through comfort, not through lies alone, but through selective truth. Exposure did not fail because people were foolish. It failed because it asked too much. It asked people to unravel years of trust, identity, and meaning, all at once. Meanwhile, pastors learned from each cycle. They adjusted messaging, tightened inner circles, refined crisis responses. Each scandal became a lesson in survival. What mattered was not what happened, but how it was framed. Not whether accusations were true, but whether followers felt safe ignoring them. This chapter reveals the most uncomfortable reality of all. Power does not require silence. It only requires interpretation. As long as leaders control the story people tell themselves, influence remains intact. And so, millions continued to follow, not because they hadn't seen the exposure, but because they had been taught how to survive it. What comes next is not about belief anymore. It is about consequences. Who paid the price, who didn't, and why the system continues to repeat itself, even now. Benny Hinn. The cost of this system was never paid by the men at the center of it. It was paid quietly over the years by the people who believed the most. The elderly donor mailing checks from fixed incomes. The grieving widow said that a financial seed would unlock healing. The family who delayed medical care because faith was framed as a substitute. These stories rarely made headlines. They happened in silence, one household at a time. For every televised sermon promising a breakthrough, there were viewers who took the message literally. They gave not what they had left over, but what they could not afford to lose. Rent money, retirement savings, emergency funds. The giving was framed as faith, but the consequences were practical and unforgiving. When miracles didn't come, the failure was internalized. The teaching had prepared them for that too. If the blessing didn't arrive, the faith must not have been strong enough. Responsibility never moved upward. It always moved inward. Spiritual disappointment is different from ordinary disillusionment. When a business fails you, you lose money. When a politician fails you, you lose trust. But when a pastor fails you, you lose meaning. For many followers, admitting deception felt like admitting that years of prayer, sacrifice, and devotion had been misdirected. That kind of realization does not arrive gently, so most people avoided it. Those who did confront it often paid a social price. Questioning leadership was framed as rebellion. Leaving was described as backsliding. Longtime members who spoke out found themselves quietly erased, no longer invited, no longer acknowledged, no longer safe to mention. Communities closed ranks, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. If one person's doubts were allowed space, others might follow. Meanwhile, the leaders remained insulated. Ministries were structured to absorb shock without collapsing. Financial reserves softened legal blows. Settlements ended conversations. Non-disclosure agreements ensured that even the most serious accusations faded without full daylight. Public repentance, when it came, was carefully managed, emotional enough to disarm critics, vague enough to avoid responsibility. What made this cycle endure was not malice alone, but momentum. Once an institution grows large enough, stopping it feels impossible. Staff depend on it. Members depend on it. Entire local economies sometimes depend on it. To confront wrongdoing would be to threaten livelihoods, reputations, and identities. And so silence became framed as wisdom. Stability became a moral good. There is a moment, often late at night, when followers begin to sense something is wrong. It is not sparked by headlines or accusations. It is quieter. A sermon that no longer feels honest. A request for money that feels urgent but hollow. A growing distance between words and actions. Many feel it and say nothing. Some ignore it. A few walk away. Those who leave often describe grief, not anger. They mourn the version of faith they once had. They mourn the community that once felt like home. They mourn the trust they gave freely. And yet, their stories are rarely amplified. They do not fit the redemption narrative. They complicate the message, so they remain unheard. This is the human cost of influence without accountability. Not just money lost, but confidence shattered. Not just trust broken, but belief reshaped by disappointment. Faith does not always disappear, but it often becomes quieter, more guarded, more private. Many never return to organized religion, not because they lost belief in God, but because they lost belief in the system that claimed to represent Him. The most unsettling truth is that none of this required secrecy. The system functioned in plain sight. The promises were broadcast. The lifestyles were visible. The power was obvious. What failed was not access to information, but the ability to confront what that information implied. And so, the question shifts again. Not, how did this happen? But, why does it keep happening? Why do new leaders step into old patterns? Why do warnings sound familiar decades later? Why does exposure feel loud, but change feel absent? The answer is uncomfortable because it implicates everyone involved. Leaders who learned they could survive, institutions that learned to protect themselves, and audiences who learned that belief felt safer than doubt. This chapter does not end with resolution. It ends with recognition. Recognition that the cost was real, that the damage extended beyond headlines, that millions followed, not because they were blind, but because they were human. And that is what makes the system so powerful and so difficult to dismantle. Pat Robertson. By the time people begin to ask how this cycle can be broken, they are usually asking the wrong question. The system does not survive because it is hidden. It survives because it is familiar. It feels safe. It rewards certainty and punishes discomfort. And for decades, it has trained people to confuse spiritual peace with intellectual surrender. Many followers did not arrive here suddenly. They arrived slowly, step by step, sermon by sermon. Trust was built before power was visible. Obedience was taught before authority was questioned. By the time warning signs appeared, loyalty was already rooted deep enough to resist logic. Walking away would not just mean changing churches. It would mean re-examining years of decisions, sacrifices, and beliefs that shaped entire lives. This is why exposure alone has never been enough. Facts can be rejected. Documents can be explained away. Accusations can be reframed, but identity is harder to confront. When a pastor becomes part of who someone is, how they pray, vote, give, and raise their children, criticism feels personal. It feels like an attack on the self, and most people will protect their identity at all costs. The system also persists because it adapts. Each generation of leaders studies the failures of the last. Language becomes softer, excess becomes quieter, accountability appears just visible enough to reassure, never enough to restrain. The surface improves while the structure remains unchanged. To outsiders, it looks like reform. To insiders, it feels like continuity. There is also the problem of selective outrage. Scandals come and go in waves, competing with countless other crises. Attention moves on, fatigue sets in. Viewers who once felt shocked become numb. And leaders know this. Time becomes their greatest ally. If they can outlast the headlines, they can outlast the consequences. But beneath all of this is something more difficult to name: a hunger. Many followers are not chasing power or wealth. They are chasing reassurance. They want to believe that someone knows the answers, that chaos has meaning, that suffering has purpose. In a world that feels increasingly unstable, certainty is seductive. And pastors who speak without hesitation become magnets for that need. This does not excuse deception, but it explains its reach. Systems of influence grow strongest where fear and hope overlap, where people are promised protection from doubt itself, where questioning is framed as weakness rather than wisdom. Breaking the cycle does not begin with removing leaders. History shows that empty pulpits are quickly filled. It begins with changing expectations, with teaching that faith and accountability are not opposites, that leadership without transparency is not spiritual maturity, but risk, that humility should be visible, not just spoken. It also requires listening to voices that were once dismissed, former members, quiet doubters, those who left without drama. Their stories do not fit neat narratives, but they carry truth without spectacle. They reveal what life looks like after devotion fades, the confusion, the grief, and sometimes the relief. For many older followers, this realization arrives late, not because they were naive, but because they were loyal. Loyalty was once considered a virtue, and in many areas of life, it still is. But loyalty without limits becomes surrender. And surrender, when it is demanded rather than chosen, becomes exploitation. This chapter is not a call to abandon faith. It is a call to reclaim it, to separate belief from personality, to understand that no human voice should be immune to scrutiny, that reverence does not require blindness, that questions are not enemies of belief, but its safeguards. What remains after exposure is choice. Some will continue to follow, some will quietly step away, others will stay and demand change. All of these responses are human, but only one disrupts the cycle. The future of this system does not depend on pastors alone. It depends on audiences willing to sit with discomfort, willing to value truth over reassurance, willing to accept that faith can survive doubt, but power often cannot. And that is why this story matters, not because of 10 names, but because the pattern they represent is still alive, still evolving, still waiting for the moment when belief becomes strong enough to refuse being controlled. That moment has not arrived yet, but every question asked brings it closer. Paula White. What happens after belief cracks is rarely dramatic. There is no thunder, no public announcement, no final sermon that marks the end. For most people, it begins quietly. A moment of hesitation before donating. A sermon that once inspired now feels rehearsed. A question that lingers longer than it should. This is the phase leaders fear the most. Not rebellion, but awakening. Awakening does not mean losing faith. It means separating God from the men who claim to speak exclusively for Him. For decades, many followers were taught that spiritual authority flowed in one direction, from the pulpit to the people. To question that flow felt dangerous. But once someone realizes that faith can exist without surrendering judgment, the system weakens. This realization often brings grief. People mourn the certainty they once had, the simplicity, the feeling of being guided. Certainty is comforting, especially in later stages of life, when the world feels unfamiliar and fast. Letting go of it can feel like stepping into fog. But clarity rarely arrives without discomfort. Some respond by retreating inward. Faith becomes private. Prayer becomes quiet. Church attendance becomes occasional or symbolic. Others seek smaller communities where leadership feels accessible and accountability is personal. And some walk away entirely, not in anger, but in exhaustion. They are tired of carrying contradictions that were never theirs to begin with. The most difficult part is reconciling the good with the harm. Many people truly benefited from these ministries. They found hope, discipline, community, and meaning. Acknowledging that those gifts existed alongside manipulation creates tension, but maturity allows both truths to stand. Something can help you and still be wrong. For leaders, this phase is dangerous because it can't be controlled. Doubt spreads silently. It doesn't need platforms or protests. It moves through conversations, glances, pauses. Once people begin comparing notes, the illusion of isolation breaks. Individuals realize they were never alone in their questions. This is why control intensifies when attendance drops. Messages become sharper, warnings grow louder. Loyalty is emphasized. The language shifts from invitation to obligation. Fear returns. Fear of falling away. Fear of deception. Fear of spiritual loss. The goal is not persuasion, but containment. But containment has limits, especially among older followers who have lived long enough to recognize patterns. Many have seen institutions fail before. Governments, corporations, movements. They know charisma fades. They know power resists scrutiny. And they know that silence often protects the wrong people. For some, the final break comes not from scandal, but from exhaustion. The endless cycles, the same apologies, the same explanations, the same return to normal. At a certain point, hope for reform becomes heavier than the decision to leave. This chapter is not about where everyone ends up. It is about the moment when authority loses its grip, when belief stops being outsourced, when individuals reclaim the right to think, to question, to pause. The system depended on speed, fast answers, fast forgiveness, fast movement, past discomfort. Awakening slows everything down. It introduces reflection, and reflection is incompatible with manipulation. What follows is not chaos. It is adjustment, a rebalancing of power, a redefinition of faith, and for many, a quiet sense of relief, not because everything is solved, but because honesty has finally entered the room. The story does not end here, but from this point forward, it cannot continue the same way. Because once people realize that belief should never require blindness, influence begins to shrink. And that may be the most dangerous revelation of all, not for faith, but for those who relied on controlling it. Jim Bakar. When influence begins to fade, it rarely disappears cleanly. It fragments. Some followers drift away quietly. Others stay but disengage emotionally. A smaller, more devoted core remains, louder, more defensive, more convinced that they are holding the line against collapse. This is the stage where power feels threatened, and threatened power behaves differently. Leaders who once spoke gently now speak urgently. Messages that were once about hope become warnings. The language of love gives way to the language of danger. The world is framed as hostile. Outsiders are portrayed as deceived. Former members become cautionary tales, not named directly, but described clearly enough to serve as examples. The purpose is not instruction, it is containment. This shift is subtle but familiar to anyone who has watched institutions struggle to survive. When growth slows, control tightens. Loyalty is measured not by quiet belief, but by visible obedience. Attendance becomes proof. Giving becomes commitment. Agreement becomes righteousness. The system begins to reward those who defend it most aggressively. For the remaining followers, this creates a powerful identity. They are no longer just believers. They are guardians, protectors of truth, survivors of persecution. This framing gives meaning to resistance. It turns doubt into betrayal and departure into loss of salvation. Staying feels heroic. Leaving feels dangerous. At this stage, exposure no longer threatens the system. It strengthens it. Every new criticism becomes evidence that the group is special, that they are misunderstood, that they alone possess clarity while the world descends into confusion. This mindset insulates belief from correction. Facts are filtered through loyalty before they are considered. The irony is that many of these followers are deeply sincere. They are not defending power for its own sake. They are defending stability, familiar rhythms, a sense of order in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. For older believers especially, change feels exhausting. The system offers continuity when everything else seems uncertain. Meanwhile, leaders adapt again. Platforms shrink but intensify. Messages become more targeted. Audiences become more segmented. Those who remain are spoken to directly, personally. Intimacy increases even as transparency decreases. The circle tightens. This is often when leaders shift their legacy. If expansion is no longer guaranteed, preservation becomes the goal. Control is handed to family members. Trusted insiders are elevated. Structures are redesigned to survive without public approval. Influence becomes quieter, but more entrenched. And still, the cost continues. Not always in money or headlines, but in emotional strain. Followers feel pressure to defend positions they privately struggle with. Questions are swallowed. Doubt is postponed. Many remain, not because they are convinced, but because leaving feels like erasing their past. This chapter reveals a difficult truth. Not all power collapses under exposure. Some power contracts and hardens. It becomes more resistant, more ideological, more insulated from outside reality. And in that form, it can last far longer than expected. But contraction is not victory. It is survival. And survival, when sustained by fear and loyalty rather than trust, is fragile. It depends on silence. It depends on repetition. It depends on keeping people busy enough not to reflect too deeply. Yet reflection continues, quietly, in private moments, in conversations that begin with hesitation and end with honesty. The system cannot hear these moments, but it is shaped by them. This is the paradox of influence. The louder it demands loyalty, the more it reveals insecurity. The more it resists scrutiny, the clearer its limits become. Power that cannot tolerate questions eventually shrinks to those willing to stop asking them. And that is where the story pauses, not with collapse, not with triumph, but with a narrowing circle, a system still standing, but no longer unquestioned. What comes next is not spectacle, it is reckoning. And reckoning does not arrive on schedule. It arrives when enough people decide that belief does not need permission to think. That decision, once made, cannot be undone. Jerry Falwell, Jr. At some point, the question shifts from who holds power to why it was given so freely in the first place. This is the most uncomfortable stage of reflection because it no longer focuses on leaders alone. It turns inward. It asks what emotional needs were met, what fears were soothed, and what responsibilities were quietly handed over in exchange for certainty. This is where the story becomes less about pastors and more about people. For many followers, especially those who lived through decades of social change, these leaders represented stability. Wars, cultural upheaval, economic uncertainty, and moral confusion passed through their lives like storms. Institutions failed, traditions weakened, communities fragmented. In that chaos, the church and the voice at the pulpit felt like solid ground, a place where answers were clear and values were firm. Giving trust did not feel reckless. It felt necessary. That trust was not irrational. It was built carefully, over time. Sermons spoke directly to personal struggles. Language was intimate, reassuring, familiar. Followers felt seen, even when they were one among millions. The bond formed was emotional, not transactional, and emotional bonds are far more difficult to sever than logical ones. But emotional dependence carries a hidden cost. When people begin to rely on leaders not just for guidance, but for interpretation of reality itself, something shifts. Questions that once belonged to the individual are outsourced. Moral decisions become collective. Personal responsibility fades into group consensus. This is not unique to religion. It happens in politics, corporations, and movements of every kind. But when it happens in the context of faith, the stakes feel eternal. Over time, many followers stopped asking whether teachings aligned with their conscience. They asked whether teachings aligned with authority. Obedience became synonymous with faithfulness. Doubt became something to manage, not explore. And curiosity was slowly reframed as danger. What makes this stage so difficult to confront is that it challenges a deeply held belief about oneself. Most people do not see themselves as passive. They see themselves as thoughtful, principled, intentional. Accepting that influence shaped their worldview feels like admitting weakness. And so, the mind protects itself. It rationalizes. It minimizes. It reframes. This is why exposure alone never dismantled the system. Information threatens leaders, but reflection threatens identity, and identity is defended fiercely. For older generations in particular, identity is tied to consistency. Changing one's mind late in life feels destabilizing. It raises painful questions. What else might I have been wrong about? What did I pass down to my children? What did I defend that should have been questioned? These questions are heavy. Many choose silence instead. Silence allows life to continue without confrontation. It preserves relationships. It avoids conflict. But silence also preserves systems that depend on it. Yet something remarkable happens when silence breaks, not publicly, but privately. When someone allows themselves to sit with doubt without rushing to resolve it. When they acknowledge discomfort without assigning blame. When they admit that trust was given generously, perhaps too generously, but with good intentions. This is not collapse. This is growth. For many, this realization does not lead to rejection of faith. It leads to a quieter, sturdier version of it, one that no longer needs spectacle, one that is less interested in certainty and more interested in honesty, one that understands belief as a personal journey, not a subscription to authority. This is also where responsibility returns. People begin to recognize that leaders did not take power alone. It was offered, not maliciously, but willingly. In moments of fear, grief, or confusion, surrender felt easier than discernment. Recognizing this does not mean assigning guilt. It means reclaiming agency. The system thrived because it met real needs: belonging, meaning, direction, community. These needs did not disappear when trust eroded. They simply went unmet for a time, and in that gap, many realized that no institution should monopolize them. Communities began forming in smaller, quieter ways. Conversations replaced sermons. Shared questions replaced shared answers. Faith became less performative and more personal. For some, this felt like loss. For others, it felt like relief. This chapter matters because it reframes the entire story. It moves away from villains and victims and toward understanding. Understanding how influence works, how trust is built, how power settles into places it was never meant to occupy. The most dangerous myth this system relied on was the idea that authority must be unquestioned to be effective. In reality, authority that cannot withstand scrutiny is already unstable, and belief that cannot survive doubt is fragile. What emerges from this reflection is not cynicism, but clarity. A recognition that faith and freedom are not enemies, that leadership should serve, not dominate, that reverence should never require surrendering thought. This is the point where the system loses its greatest advantage. Not money, not platforms, not followers, but unquestioned legitimacy. Once people realize they have the right to think without permission, influence changes shape. And while this realization may not make headlines, it reshapes lives quietly. One conversation, one pause, one honest question at a time. That is how the cycle truly begins to end. T.D. Jakes. What comes after disillusionment is not emptiness, as many fear. It is reconstruction, slow, uneven, and deeply personal. This phase does not announce itself with dramatic exits or public statements. It unfolds quietly, often over months or years, as people begin to rebuild meaning without relying on a single authoritative voice to define it for them. This is where the deepest transformation happens, not because it is loud, but because it is permanent. For many older believers, this stage feels unfamiliar and even unsettling. They were raised in a world where institutions were trusted by default. Churches were moral anchors. Pastors were guides, not figures to be questioned. Stability came from consistency, and consistency was treated as virtue. To suddenly reconsider these assumptions late in life can feel destabilizing, as if the ground beneath long-held beliefs has shifted without warning. Reconstruction begins with a simple but difficult question. What do I believe when no one is telling me what to believe? This question does not have a ready-made answer. It cannot be resolved through sermons, books, or televised reassurance. It requires sitting with uncertainty, something the old system actively discouraged. For some, this uncertainty feels like loss. For others, it feels like relief. As people begin this process, they often discover that much of what they once believed was inherited rather than examined. Moral positions absorbed through repetition, political views wrapped in spiritual language, emotional responses reinforced by group approval. When these layers begin to peel away, what remains can feel fragile, even incomplete, but it is also more honest. This stage is not about replacing one authority with another. Many resist that instinct consciously. They no longer want certainty handed to them. They want understanding they can live with. Faith, for those who retain it, becomes less about absolute answers and more about orientation, how to live, how to treat others, how to hold meaning without needing it to be unchanging. Leadership looks different now. Charisma loses its power. Confidence without humility feels suspicious. Leaders are no longer assumed to be wise because they are visible. They are evaluated by consistency, transparency, and restraint. For many, this realization is sobering. They recognize how easily authority once bypassed discernment. This shift is often accompanied by grief, not anger, but mourning. Mourning the certainty that once felt comforting. Mourning the simplicity of belonging without tension. Mourning years spent defending something that now feels compromised. Grief does not mean those years were meaningless. It means they mattered. Relationships become complicated during Reconstruction. Faith communities were not just spiritual spaces, they were social worlds. Friendships, routines, and identities were built inside them. Stepping back can feel like social exile. Conversations grow cautious. Shared language disappears. Some relationships endure through mutual respect. Others quietly dissolve, not through conflict, but through silence. At the same time, new connections begin to form, often smaller, less formal, built around honesty rather than agreement. These connections do not demand uniform belief. They allow doubt. They allow disagreement. They feel less certain, mercenary, but more resilient. They survive because they are not dependent on a single narrative holding everything together. One of the most difficult realizations in this phase is accepting personal participation. Not participation in wrongdoing, but participation in a system that rewarded surrender. Many people realize they were not merely misled, they were choosing comfort over confrontation. This realization can sting, but it also restores agency. It shifts the story from victimhood to ownership. Ownership allows forgiveness, not as denial, but as release. Forgiveness of leaders who disappointed. Forgiveness of oneself for staying too long, defending too strongly, ignoring unease. Forgiveness does not erase harm. It allows movement forward without carrying the weight of constant self-blame. As Reconstruction continues, belief becomes quieter, less performative, less interested in being right, more interested in being honest. Many discover that faith does not disappear when authority dissolves. It relocates, it moves inward, it becomes less dependent on certainty and more grounded in conscience. This is where power truly shifts. Systems that depend on obedience struggle when people no longer outsource their judgment. Influence weakens when followers become thinkers. Not rebellious thinkers, but reflective ones. The kind who pause before agreeing, who ask before defending, who no longer feel compelled to choose sides immediately. The story of these pastors is often framed as a cautionary tale about corrupted leadership, but the deeper lesson is broader and more enduring. Any system that discourages questioning will eventually attract people seeking certainty more than truth. And any audience that confuses reassurance with wisdom will eventually face disappointment. Reconstruction does not promise clarity. It promises honesty. It does not offer comfort on demand. It offers integrity. For many, especially later in life, that trade feels worth it. They no longer want belief that requires constant defense. They want belief that can coexist with doubt without collapsing. This chapter is not an ending. It is a transition, a movement away from borrowed certainty toward earned understanding, away from authority that demands loyalty toward meaning that invites reflection. What remains is not emptiness, but responsibility. responsibility to think carefully, to question respectfully, to recognize when comfort is being used as control, to remember that belief is strongest when it belongs to the individual, not when it is protected by power. This is not the death of faith. It is the end of unquestioned authority, and for many, it marks the beginning of something quieter, humbler, and finally, their own. Franklin Graham. In the end, what remains is not a list of names, scandals, or headlines. What remains is a realization that settles slowly and stays. A realization that power, once trusted without limits, rarely gives itself back willingly. And that faith, when fused too tightly to authority, becomes something fragile instead of something strong. For many who followed these pastors for decades, the reckoning does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, a memory that feels different now, a sermon replayed in the mind with new weight, a request for loyalty that once felt spiritual but now feels heavy. These moments do not demand answers immediately. They simply refuse to disappear. This is the phase no leader can control because it happens internally. No statement can undo it. No apology can redirect it. Once someone begins to separate belief from obedience, the relationship with authority changes permanently. Even if they remain outwardly loyal, something inside has shifted. The most difficult truth to accept is that nothing was stolen suddenly. Trust was given gradually. Power was handed over piece by piece, often in moments of vulnerability. Grief, fear, illness, uncertainty, loneliness. In those moments, guidance feels like relief, certainty feels like protection, and questioning feels unnecessary. That is how systems like this grow, not through force, but through comfort, not through deception alone, but through repetition. Messages repeated long enough stop sounding like persuasion and start sounding like truth. Over time, obedience is no longer requested, it is assumed. When exposure finally arrives, it feels disruptive not because it is shocking, but because it interrupts a story people were still living inside. And stories are harder to abandon than facts. Stories give meaning. They explain suffering. They justify sacrifice. Walking away from them feels like losing direction. This is why many never leave publicly. They stay physically while leaving emotionally. They nod while no longer believing fully. They give less. They listen differently. They notice patterns they once ignored. This quiet withdrawal does not make headlines, but it changes everything. For some, the break is more decisive. They reach a point where continuing requires pretending. Pretending not to see, not to question, not to feel the discomfort rising. And pretending, over time, becomes exhausting. Leaving then becomes an act of honesty rather than rebellion. For others still, the reckoning leads to reform rather than exit. They remain, but with boundaries. They no longer excuse everything. They no longer accept secrecy as spirituality. They no longer equate authority with holiness. This path is often lonely, but it represents a refusal to surrender conscience. What unites all these responses is a single realization. Belief should never require surrendering thought. Faith that cannot survive scrutiny is not faith. It is dependency. And dependency, once exposed, loses its power. This chapter matters because it marks the point where responsibility shifts back to the individual, not in blame, but in agency. Leaders cannot be held accountable if followers refuse to acknowledge their role in sustaining the system. Power does not exist in isolation. It exists in relationships. Accepting this does not mean condemning oneself. It means recognizing that trust was given in good faith, but without safeguards. And that wisdom often arrives later than we wish. Many older followers struggle with this realization more than younger ones, not because they are less capable of reflection, but because they have more history invested. Decades of consistency feel harder to reevaluate than a few years of belief. Admitting misjudgment late in life can feel like erasing part of one's identity. But growth does not erase the past. It reframes it. It allows people to say, I believed because I hoped. I trusted because I wanted stability. I stayed because I valued loyalty. These are not failures. They are human choices made in complex circumstances. The danger lies not in having trusted, but in refusing to adjust once the cost of that trust becomes visible. The final exposure is not about pastors at all. It is about recognizing patterns that repeat wherever authority is insulated from accountability. The names change, the language evolves, the platforms modernize, but the structure remains the same unless people decide they will no longer participate without conditions. That decision does not require anger. It requires clarity. Clarity that leaders are human and therefore fallible. Clarity that humility must be demonstrated, not declared. Clarity that transparency is not persecution. Clarity that faith is strongest when it is chosen freely, not enforced emotionally. This clarity reshapes belief. It removes spectacle. It strips away performance. It leaves something quieter, less impressive, but more durable. Belief that does not depend on constant reassurance. Belief that allows doubt without fear. Belief that does not need a gatekeeper. Some will call this weakening faith. It is not. It is maturing it. The systems described in this documentary will likely continue in some form. New leaders will emerge. New messages will be packaged. New audiences will be drawn in. Influence rarely disappears completely, but it does change when people become harder to control. The future of faith does not belong to those who speak the loudest. It belongs to those willing to think honestly, to pause before defending, to ask who benefits from certainty, to recognize when emotional comfort is being traded for autonomy. What ultimately remains after everything has been said, exposed, defended, denied, and rationalized is not outrage. It is awareness. Awareness does not arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, often long after the noise has faded. It settles in slowly, changing how past words sound, how memories feel, and how trust is measured. This is the final stage of the cycle. Not collapse, not redemption, but recognition. For many who followed these pastors for decades, recognition does not mean rejection. It means recalibration. It means seeing the relationship for what it always was, unequal. One side spoke with authority, the other listened with faith. And over time, listening turned into dependence. Not because people were weak, but because certainty was offered when life felt unstable. This is the part of the story that is hardest to accept. Power was not taken suddenly. It was given gradually, given during moments of fear, grief, illness, loneliness, and uncertainty, given when answers felt urgent and doubt felt dangerous, given because believing felt better than not knowing. That does not make believers foolish. It makes them human. What exposure did was not reveal hidden facts. Many facts were already visible. Wealth was visible. Influence was visible. Political access was visible. What exposure disrupted was interpretation. It interrupted the story that explained why all of it was necessary, justified, and untouchable. And when interpretation breaks, everything changes. For some, the change is immediate and decisive. They step away. They stop watching. They stop giving. They stop defending. They do not always announce it. They simply reclaim their attention. For others, the change is slower. They remain physically present, but mentally distant. Sermons lose authority. Appeals lose urgency. Loyalty becomes conditional. This quiet shift is more powerful than public rebellion. Institutions can survive critics. They struggle to survive indifference. There are those who choose to stay and push for reform. They ask questions that once felt forbidden. They request transparency without apology. They resist language that frames obedience as virtue and scrutiny as sin. This path is difficult, often isolating, and rarely rewarded, but it represents a refusal to surrender conscience. And then there are those who remain loyal fully and openly. Their choice is also human. Stability has value. Familiarity has comfort. Identity is not easily dismantled, especially later in life. For many, the cost of leaving feels greater than the cost of staying. This story does not end with collapse. It ends with choice. Choice to remain silent or to reflect. Choice to obey or to discern. Choice to follow or to understand. No pastor can make that choice for anyone. No institution can prevent it once it is made. And that is the quiet truth at the center of everything you have just seen. Influence only lasts as long as people agree not to examine it. The moment examination begins, sincerely, patiently, without fear, The balance shifts, not overnight, not dramatically, but permanently.